for this wonderful introduction. Can you hear me okay? I'm not going to use this system over here. Well, basically, I almost did not recognize myself in that introduction, but it's wonderful. This work is part of a grant that I received from the Spanish Ministry of Science and Innovation 2 years ago, when a group of scholars from Spain, Colombia, Puerto Rico, and the US got together with the idea of reevaluating how political changes in Spain impacted conditions in the Americas, specifically with respect to Puerto Rico, which was then, up until 1898, a colony of Spain. And so what I wanted to do as part of that grant was look differently at the situation of slavery in Puerto Rico. Often when we look at slavery, we're basically concerned with the local conditions. We look at people who were enslaved, how they worked, how they were oppressed, and how they fought oppression, and that's more or less the context. So what I wanted to do was to see what in Spain was informing slavery in Puerto Rico, to see if there was anything in Spain that was taking place that was having some kind of impact on slavery in Puerto Rico. So as part of that, we began to look at the Spanish Constitution of 1812. This Constitution of 1812 came in at the end of nearly 400 years of monarchical rule in Spain, in which the government in Spain was ruled by kings and queens. Obviously, that's an absolutist type of government, right? One person ruled. And so in the latter part of the 18th century, Spain and France were allied. They share a part of the Bourbon dynasty. And so they had a good relationship, and they used that relationship to their advantage by building a coalition against England, Holland, Germany, and other countries. But that alliance began to dissolve in the latter part of the 18th century over the issue of dynastic rule. Some people in Spain wanted one of the descendants of the king of Spain to marry into the dynasty in France and maintain that bond. There were some people in Spain who felt that although France is our ally, we ought not to go that far. We ought to pick someone locally in Spain for the succession of the monarchy. So in that particular interplay of choosing the next king of Spain, there was a dispute between France and Spain. And as a result of that, Napoleon invaded Spain in 1808. 100,000 troops were brought into Spain to subdue the Spanish homeland, and the king of Spain was taken hostage. He was basically deposed as king and put away for some time. During that particular time, Napoleon's brother was installed as the king of Spain, and a lot of people in Spain obviously did not like that. They didn't like a foreign, aristocrat to come in and rule over Spain. So there was some significant resistance on the part of the Spanish elite, particularly aristocratic members of the Spanish government who did not want to be ruled by a French monarch. So they began to organize themselves first in local governing bodies known as juntas. And these juntas basically were city councils that became de facto government units within Spain, so they ruled over their own territories. Eventually they agreed to form a Junta Suprema Central, a large body that would represent the interests of all of the Spaniard, all of the city councils in Spain unified in one single body. Eventually, the Junta Central Suprema organized a resistance movement against the French. And in the resistance movement, of course, they needed supplies, they needed money, and they needed coalition building. They needed to persuade everybody in Spain and in Spanish America that it was a good cause. As part of that goal that they had of bringing everybody together, they decided to convene a constitutional assembly in 1810. The Constitutional Assembly then issued a summons or an invitation to Spanish American deputies to come to Spain and take part in the discussion regarding the new constitution that they wanted to set up in Spain at that time. So the constitution was developed, and this is an image of the session that took place in 1812. During this particular meeting, which took place on the outside of the city of Cadiz, the British were lending a hand to the Spanish because the British were concerned that if Napoleon got his way in Spain, eventually the Napoleonic invasion will stretch over to England. So the British sent the Armada, and the Armada was on the coast of Spain watching over the proceedings while the Spanish deputies were deciding on the fate of the government. Because of that, many of the Spanish deputies felt an obligation, implied obligation, to pass new decisions, take on new decisions that will basically not anger or that will support the British supporters, that will be in line with the British supporters. The British at that time were interested in abolishing the slave trade because they had reached a point in their economic development where slavery was no longer viable. They had basically developed an industrial economy. They were moving into free labor. Slave labor was an impediment to the further growth of capitalism, so there was a need to move away from slavery. So the Spanish deputies then had to consider that particular angle because the British are stationed on the coast of Spain supporting us in our fight against the French invaders. And so there were liberal and conservative people at this convention. Eventually the Constitution was passed, it was enacted, it was created. It made all subjects of Spain that were born free to be subjects of the new constitution or the new republican form of government. In this case, it's not a republican form of government because in the end it became a constitutional monarchy, almost like a combination government between a republic and a monarchy. And so while all subjects that were free were recognized as subjects of the new entity, the new polity, when it came down to citizenship, citizenship was extended only to people that were white. In Spain, it would be citizens of Spain, but in Spanish America, it meant that only those Creoles or locally born white folks would be considered citizens of the new entity. Free blacks and mulattoes were eligible for citizenship under certain conditions and upon an application. Those conditions including things like probity, good reputation, maybe having a good job, knowing how to read or write. I mean, all of those things were not spelled out in the Constitution, but it was implied that there would be a series of qualifications for the people of color. One of the major decisions that they also had to make was what to do with the slave trade. Spain was participating in the slave trade, and slavery was the economic engine that kept the Spanish American colonies afloat, particularly those in Cuba and Puerto Rico, which had entered the slave trade late in the 18th century and were beginning to grow a plantation economy. And so if you attract those deputies from Cuba and Puerto Rico to the discussions at the Assembly, you have to consider their interest in keeping slavery intact, in maintaining slavery. So this was a discussion that the deputies had to consider. You can see in this image how the slave triangular trade functioned. A lot of the goods from Europe were being, I don't know, this has, a lot of the goods in Europe were being created here in the factories in Europe. They were being sold in Africa in exchange for human beings that were being transported to the New World, particularly the Caribbean, and used as chattel property for the production of raw materials that were then shipped out to Europe. And the whole cycle will be repeated. These raw materials will be then turned into commodities, and they will be sold again, not only in Africa, but in the rest of Europe and in the New World, the United States and Canada, or what will become Canada. There were some significant input from deputies from the Spanish colonies. There were not many of them because the Spanish Constitutional Assembly had provision to limit the numbers of Spanish American deputies. So there was only 63 of them in a body of over 300 people. But nevertheless, the 63 people included some significant Creole individuals, and one of them was the Mexican deputy Jose Miguel Guridi y Alcocer. He proposed the gradual abolition of slavery, including the abolition of the slave trade. That was a radical proposal at that time, and one that was not supported by the whole assembly, and I'll explain that in a minute. There was a second deputy from Spain who also supported the proposal. He thought that slavery had reached its point of, where it was no longer viable economically. Whenever you force people to work, they usually don't do the best work that they can do. And also they're expensive. You have to have military forces to control slaves. And so overall, slavery brings about costs that free labor does not generate. And so that was one of the criticisms. However, the Mexican deputy and the Spanish deputy that supported the end of the slave trade were challenged by the Cuban deputies. The Cuban deputies that they sent were two individuals, and both of them were pro-slavery. And so they argued strongly that if you're going to get the support of Cuba in this constitutional assembly, you need to support the slave trade. It is basically the blood that keeps the organ, the system in Spain going, in Cuba going. We're producing coffee and sugar in huge amounts, and that money that is generated by coffee and sugar is the revenue that is going to make you successful in the war against the French. So if you want the support of Cuba, you need to keep slavery going. The Puerto Rican deputy, the record of the Puerto Rican deputy is not known. He was in fact a slave owner, so we don't really know what decision he had or what input he provided. We do know some things anecdotally that he did, and I will speak on that in a minute. But the commission basically said, we're going to hold on to slavery and the slave trade and go on with the rest of the Constitutional Convention. The deputy for Puerto Rico was Ramon Power, like the word power, like strength, and he was of a Puerto Rican or Irish descent. He owned a plantation in Puerto Rico. When he sat in the convention, he was part of a small commission that was delegated the subject of the slave trade. So he had input on that decision, but somehow he did not prevail. He did write a letter to his mother in Puerto Rico, letting her know that the Spanish Parliament was considering the end of the slave trade and slavery in itself. And should that take place, I want you to be the first one in Puerto Rico to free the slaves. So that's why he informed his mother. I don't know that qualifies as being abolitionist, but at least it qualifies as self-interested person who probably said, I want to get credit, right? So should things turn out the other way, I want to get the credit of being an abolitionist, but in the meantime, we don't really know whether he's too for or against slavery. Most of the people in Puerto Rico who delegated the job of representing the island to power were not in favor of the slave trade or slavery. So we know that. So if he did have input in the convention, most likely he sided with the abolitionists, but we don't know that for sure. The reason for that is landowners in Puerto Rico were concerned that nearby is Haiti. Haiti had undergone a revolution from 1791 to 1804. In 1804, only a few years prior to the convention, Haiti had become a republic, a black republic. And Haiti has sent spies throughout the Caribbean trying to incite slave population to rebel against their owners. So obviously, the landowners in Puerto Rico were not interested in having the slave trade continue in Puerto Rico because they felt that in due time there could be an impending race war. And in a race war, in an island in which the majority population was either free black or enslaved, that was not the case in Puerto Rico, but it was the case in Cuba, white would therefore be eradicated. They would be annihilated. In the case of Puerto Rico, that was not the case, but the Puerto Rican landowners were thinking long term. We want to make money, but we want to maintain power. And if we don't abolish slavery now, in the future, this island could suffer the same fate as Haiti. So the Haitian Revolution occurred in the nearby island of Saint-Domingue, French colony. 400,000 slaves rebelled against 30,000 owners. They eventually overpowered the owners, ran them out of the island or killed them, and many of them ended up in Puerto Rico and Cuba. That was another reason why the local landowners in Puerto Rico were not in support of the slave trade. But what I want to do now is talk about two instances where the constitutional language and the constitutional power making and the decision making regarding the Constitution had an effect on Puerto Rico, particularly on the subject of slavery. In one instance happened in El Día de los Reyes, the Day of the Three Kings Day. Early January in Puerto Rico, they celebrated the Day of the Three Kings. In Puerto Rico, in the slave quarters, people had a tendency to use that day to celebrate the kings in Africa, or to name a queen and a king in Africa and have a what we might call a carnival. And they would do parading and they would celebrate it. The Spanish would tolerate this because it was a way of allowing the slaves to vent out their frustration and to have a day of enjoyment. So it was part of and parcel of the whole idea of oppressing people. You oppress them by giving them diversionary activities that keep them away from thinking about fighting you and destroying you. So what happened when the letter, when Power wrote that letter, was that the mother read the letter aloud in the house in the presence of household domestics that were enslaved. So they heard her read the letter. And in the letter, she basically said, you know, my son wants me to free the slaves in case the courts decree the abolition of slavery. She started crying. Nobody knows really why she was crying. She could have cried, I speculate, right? That she could have cried because, my goodness, I'm going to lose my property, you know, my slaves. Or she could have cried because she said, my goodness, we're going to be on the books, in the history books, as the first family to actually put the slaves, you know, in freedom. No one really knows, but the slaves, they took that the letter was probably evidence that the Spanish Parliament had decreed the abolition of slavery. That's the way they read it, and they understood it. So they went outside the plantation and began to spread the word. And so instead of telling all the slaves that she had received a letter that set the tone that I had just shared with you, they basically distorted the letter and say, what we get from the whites is partial information. It is likely that the courts decree the abolition of slavery, and you'll be a fool if you don't do something. What we ought to do, and the word got out, and there's testimony on this, a lot of testimony on this, that was compiled by the authorities when they began interviewing slaves. And I use the word slaves in the context of that time, by the way. I prefer to use the word enslaved, or people held in bondage. But the enslaved were interrogated by the authorities, military tribunal, judges, prosecutors, and so on, to determine just exactly what they had been spreading. And basically what they said was that the Spanish had decreed the abolition of slavery and that the whites were keeping that information from them. Some of the slaves said, we ought to start decapitating them like they did in Haiti. That was actually in the testimony. Other slaves said, if they don't give us our freedom, the blood will flow even in greater amounts than the one in Saint-Domingue. Other slaves said, you'll be a fool to work when you know that you're already free and the whites are keeping the freedom from us. So the conspiracy began to spread out. In addition to that, and almost at the same time that the letter was being read, a ship arrived from Spain with news about the constitutional discussions in Spain. And the ship carried basically a request to the Spanish Creoles in Puerto Rico that they ought to begin the collection of funds in order to support the Spanish military defense against the French invaders. In other words, start a collection. ask for people for money and let us know how much money you have, send that money back to us so we can buy weapons. But the crew members, which included one slave, did not say that. They deserted the ship when they landed in San Juan, went into the capital, began to socialize with the local population and told them, I know what we got to tell the people is this, but what you don't know is that those deputies are meeting in private, behind doors, and they already decreed the abolition of slavery. And so the ship crew began to spread the word out. That word got to all of the local people in San Juan, especially the enslaved, and they began to spread the word from one person to the other until people began to run away from the plantations. And this is a depiction of a maroon or a person who fled into the bush in Puerto Rico or Cuba or any place in the New World, and they began to talk to one another. They created a network. Essentially, Jacinto and Fermin, who fled from the power plantation, began to spread the word. The word got to Romualdo and Margarita at another plantation. When they told Antonio had already heard from another slave, and so all of a sudden this network of people getting the word out mouth to mouth or person to person. Eventually, the conspiracy engulfed the entire island, and they called it the conspiracy of the day of the Three Kings Day. It went from San Juan to Rio Piedras, there to Guaynabo, Bayamón, Toa Baja, San Germán, Cabo Rojo, Aguadilla. Practically all of the corners of the island were being covered with news. Now, this is at a time when it would take you approximately a month to travel by land from one point of the island to the other one. It took days for that information to get from one part of the island to the other one. So this shows us a couple of different things, and one is that the enslaved were oppressed, but they still had a humanity. And they also have ways of communicating, effective ways. And they use this effective system of communication to get that information from one to the other and to notify one another. In fact, some of the enslaved people in Puerto Rico actually took the step of getting on a canoe or a boat and sailing off to Saint Domingue in full expectation that they were going to gain their freedom upon landing in Haiti. And so this became a big deal in Puerto Rico. This shows you a map of the island. When I say Cabo Rojo, it's right here. Right? Aguadilla is here. This is San Juan. All of these areas were being informed of the news that was in a sense false, but reshaped into a rumor of freedom in Puerto Rico. There were other elements in the news story that were also intensifying a belief that freedom was at hand and that the Spanish government was keeping it from them. And one is that in nearby Haiti, Henry Christophe had been declared king. And so basically the word that the king of Spain had decreed the freedom, and there is a black king nearby who's also offering on freedom, was a powerful inducement for people to believe that this was possible. The Haitian government also put out a decree saying that if you're Indian or black and you're fleeing from a plantation or a bondage situation, you could become free if you come to Haiti. And so this was something that a lot of people knew about. They knew that if they could get away from Puerto Rico and go to Haiti nearby, you could be free. There was also an attack on Puerto Rico in 1797, during which many slaves escaped, and the Spanish offered a lot of them freedom if they joined the struggle against the attackers. In this case, it was the British government had attacked Puerto Rico. At the end of that attack, the Spanish government reneged on the offer to free a lot of the slaves that have fought the British. And now the slaves in this event in 1812 actually repeated that to one another. they were saying to one another, look what happened in 1797. They offered us freedom and they didn't give it to us. And so we know that these things can happen. And then a lot of them were hoping that the black militia in Puerto Rico were going to side with them. They felt that free blacks in Puerto Rico were probably not much better than they were. And in the event of a race war or a rebellion, that the free black militia was not going to come to the aid of the Spanish government. So that we can count, they said, on the free black militia. So this was all the discussion that was taking place at that time. Let me give you another instance now, a little later, 15 years forward. The Constitution was enacted in 1812. It remained in force until 1814. The king was basically came back to Spain, abolished the Constitution. The Constitution was then reissued at the end of his reign in 1820. It remained in force until 1823. The new king again abolished the Constitution. The Constitution was then reinstated in 1836. By 1836, things had changed in Puerto Rico somewhat. The constitutional provisions of 1812, 1814, 1820, 1823 have brought about changes, significant changes in the institutional colonial arrangement. And one of them was the creation of a Supreme Court, or the equivalent of a Supreme Court in Puerto Rico, and they call this Audiencia Territorial. And so the Audiencia Territorial was made up of local judges, but by this time a lot of the judges have to deal with a lot of the consequences of the Spanish colonialism. And they're beginning to have conflicts because they're trying to apply law against constitutional regime that does not observe law. And so they are conflicted. And so now in 1836, they hear that the Spanish deputies have been thrown out of the Spanish parliament. Under the constitutional changes in 1836, the Spanish government decreed that deputies from Cuba and Puerto Rico were no longer needed. You don't have to come to Spain and take place in the discussions. And so this angered a lot of the local leadership in Puerto Rico. If we are part of a new government that is progressive, why couldn't we be part of the discussion about what kind of government we wish to have within that form of government? And so the Spanish position was that we will pass new laws into the future that will be shaped just for you. The laws that we have, the constitutional laws, apply only to Spain. From 1837 forward, we will come up with new laws, and we'll talk about it in the near future. So that was the plan. The new laws were never enacted. So in 1838, while the laws are never enacted, by this point, Puerto Rico is part of what it is now a reconstituted Spanish empire. The colonies in the New World have seceded, have broken away from Spain, and the only two colonies left is Cuba and Puerto Rico. The Spanish military and the economic apparatus of the Spanish government is focused on Puerto Rico and Cuba. Puerto Rico and Cuba are now the economic engine that is keeping the Spanish Second Empire afloat. They depend on the sugar export from Puerto Rico and Cuba, coffee exports from Cuba and Puerto Rico, to develop the revenues that is allowing the Spanish government to develop its own needs at home, including dealing with an internal civil war, and for which they needed additional funds. So they put a squeeze on Puerto Rico and Cuba for even more loans, even more taxes, even higher custom duties, and so on and so forth. And at the same time that they crack down on opposition leaders who are protesting these changes. So if you are a liberal-minded person in Puerto Rico and Cuba, and you raise your voice, you write out an article on a local media, you will be arrested. You could be jailed. Your property could be confiscated, and in some cases, then you could be expelled from Puerto Rico and Cuba. And so this is what was happening then. So basically, colonial constitutionalism was nothing more than a veneer of equality between the metropolis, Spain, and the colonies, but there was really no equality in the end. After 1812, the colonies became mere provinces of Spain that were supposed to have the same rights and duties, but they really did not. Soon the central administration in Spain imposed more and more restrictions on those who raised their voice against the changes. Here's some examples of what I call colonial constitutionalism. As I mentioned before, racial criteria was applied that limited the appointment of colonial deputies. In Spain, they calculated the representation at the Cortes by every 50,000 people or so, or by municipal government, municipal councils. In the Spanish colonies, they only recognized 2 councils. In Puerto Rico, in Cuba 2, and in Puerto Rico 1, which meant that Cuba would only have 2 deputies and Puerto Rico 1 deputy. And so in essence, even though they had a larger population, which meant that they could have more representation, they were limited to 2. The logic behind this is that the Spanish government did not count native peoples or castas or free mixed bloods in the count. They only counted the white population and decided how many deputies on the basis of the white population. Citizenship was extended only to Creole, native peoples and mixed bloods were excluded. People from with African heritage could become eligible, again, if they meet certain criteria, and constitutional protections were extended only to a part of the population, but loyalty and revenues were expected of everybody, even though, so basically it's like taxation without representation, right? Everybody pays high, but no one is really represented equally in the system. So this is an example of that colonial exploitation, increased defense expenditures in order to keep the slave regime alive. It meant having more soldiers, more police units, more covert operations. It increased taxation. There was forced loans imposed on the local population. Censorship was common during this era, and mounting repression against dissenters. And any attempt to change the slave-based plantation system were not taken seriously by the Spanish government. Basically, economic diversification was something that it was not thought of or accepted by the Spanish government at this point. The issue of slavery came into place even more closer now, because now Creoles see that if they are to push for changes, they need to expand the electorate. In other words, if there's only a few whites asking for change, Spain is going to ignore that. If you enlarge the electorate, then potentially you have a unified body of people asking for the same thing, and the Spanish government will yield. How do you expand the electorate? You offer castas, or the free blacks, and free mixed bloods an opportunity to become citizens. So Creoles were interested in that, and which meant that they now become the enemies of the Spanish government, because whenever you raise the issue of universal suffrage, you raise the issue of independence or dissension. Liberal Creoles also wanted to get rid of slavery, because it was also a way to modernize the Puerto Rican economy and to be, aligned with the changes that were taking place in the modern world. Many of the Creoles in Puerto Rico and Cuba were studying in the United States, in France, in England, in Spain itself, and they were basically learning all of this new information, and what they were learning did not really match the reality of their lives back in the colonies. So a lot of them were frustrated and disappointed with the changes in Puerto Rico. Again, the Spanish government cracked down on them through expulsion, jailing, and censorship. Anti-slavery liberalism was seen as a step towards a widened citizenry, which will lead to a decline of royal revenues, because if you have slaves that are no longer slaves, they're not producing, there's no revenue. It will eventually, the government thought, it will lead to autonomy and ultimately to the Declaration of Independence. So slavery was the key that would either keep Puerto Rico hostage for many, many generations in the Creole's mind, or unlock the door to freedom down the road, such as independence. And so this, you can see this dilemma of the Creoles attempting to sort of move the discussion of slavery in a different direction when a book was penned by a government official and the book was sent to them for review. It was sent to the Supreme Court, right? And the Supreme Court used that opportunity to tear apart some of the arguments made by the book writer, who was pro-Spanish, and to point out the weaknesses in the argument as a way to eventually challenge the whole logic of colonial rule and slavery at its basis. So the book exalted the governorship of Miguel de la Torre. He was an individual who has spent probably the last 12 or 15 years at the helm of the government of Puerto Rico. He had been defeated in Peru, landed in Puerto Rico as a soldier who did not do very well against the patriots in Latin America, and ended up being the governor of Puerto Rico. He defended the government of Spain in Puerto Rico, and he's the one responsible for a lot of different things. Since the book exalted de la Torre, the Supreme Court officials who reviewed the manuscript criticized de la Torre because they wanted to point out some of the deficiencies in de la Torre's government, and some of which related to slavery. So the reviewers, they actually wrote, the book was probably a couple of hundred pages, but they wrote almost the same amount of pages in critiques to challenge the Spanish government. Here's some examples of the language that they came up with. One Supreme Court prosecutor, Fernando Perez de Rosa, said that he needed to say the naked truth in his review of the book. And he said that the book was full of errors, misstatements, and lapses of judgment. He criticized the government of de la Torre for supporting a plantation system at the expense of other economic systems that were possible then. The island's Creole leadership have wanted to move away from single crop economic production to multi-crop. In other words, multiple products that could yield multiple income. Plantation economic development only benefited big landowners who had the money and the power to establish them and run them. People of medium and low income could not get into the economic picture, so they were being squeezed out. De la Torre was not willing to entertain the idea of diversification. De la Torre was played favorites in the issuing of land grants in Puerto Rico. He basically, when land was available to people, he would only offer it to those that were his friends and who had the ability to create plantations out of those land grants. And in addition to that, even though Puerto Rico was under a treaty obligation not to allow for the importation of enslaved peoples from Africa since at least 1820, throughout the De la Torre administration, De la Torre was giving exceptional licenses to people that would then go to Africa or be allowed to import slaves to Puerto Rico. He basically used what is called today executive privilege to overrule an international treaty that prohibited him from importing slaves to Puerto Rico. And was even more bad from the point of view of the Creole was that the slave importation taxes that were collected by De la Torres were divided among his cronies, a small circle of friends, right? The port captain, the chief of police, the royal officer that was corrupt, and they all pocketed the money. The money did not really make it to the Spanish coffers, and therefore being rerouted to Spain. So now Puerto Rico was actually asked to provide even more funding that they didn't have. because De La Torre was hugging up all the money. Another person felt that he was milking the island's coffers at the expense of building roads, canals, bridges, postal services, and the entire infrastructure of the island. In other words, he was keeping the money and possibly sending it back to Spain, so that when he retired in Spain, he could then live a rich life. Puerto Rico had an economic society that was supposed to promote science and education, but the governor of De La Torre refused to give them funding. Right? Doesn't that sound a little bit like Detroit? You know what I'm saying? I mean, you know, promote science and education, the schools are underfunded, they're not being paid. And so he basically said, yeah, we have an economic society and I'm proud of it, but when you look at the budget for the economic society, people were not being paid and the projects were never being funded. And so there was no work being done to promote advances in agricultural sciences. Public schooling, hospitals, places for orphans, correctional facilities for people were also lacking in the island. Another writer, another judge, Pérez de la Rosa, complained that slavery was encouraged in Puerto Rico, even though all modern countries were moving away from it, were abolishing slavery. And basically in 1838, when this was said, Britain had abolished slavery in all the Caribbean islands. Haiti was free, no slavery. And the French would abolish slavery in 1848 in nearby Martinique, Guadeloupe, and some of the other islands. And so Puerto Rico, in their mind, in the minds of the Creole leaders, was being squeezed between countries in either side that were declaring slavery abolished. They started with abolishing the slave trade, and they were gradually abolishing slavery. So one of them, Pérez de la Rosa, argued, if slavery is legal and essential in Puerto Rico, why is it being conducted illegally? Why not do it openly? And so basically, a lot of these writers were supporting the conversion of the island's economy into a salaried workforce. Supreme Court Justice Duro Espinosa argued that what Puerto Rico needed was not enslaved workers, but industrial colonies. And he was asking the government to consider recruiting governments from different parts of Europe. England, or not England because it's Protestant, but any Catholic region in Europe. Ireland, Italy, parts of Spain, the Canary Islands, some areas in the Mediterranean area, and so on and so forth, including France. He also endorsed granting land to the peasants rather than to the big landowners. So instead of giving the land to the big people who could set up plantations, why not make the landless proletariat an efficient peasant class so that they can feed their families, and then we can have even economic development on the island. He advocated for teaching agronomy and the best practices in agricultural sciences in Puerto Rico to bring about a revival of the agricultural sector. In Puerto Rico at this point, there are no irrigation channels, there's no fertilizers, there are no mechanical devices that are being used to enhance productivity. Since slave labor was used, basically manual labor rather than machinery was doing the bulk of the work. What they wanted to do was to convert that labor into machinery, or to teach people how to become self-sufficient farmers. He said also that ultimately what slavery did was that it bred vagrancy and laziness, and eventually it fueled criminality, and criminality would eventually lead to a race war, because people who are unhappy, unemployed, they're not earning money, they're displaced, they don't have land, eventually they're going to think of all kinds of things to get even, or to get back at those that are oppressing them, and eventually that could lead into, murders or assaults, robberies, people in jail, and so on and so forth. So a lot of these Creoles were thinking that instead of building more jails, and why don't you build more opportunity for people? Kind of was thinking that maybe we sometimes think, although lately we've been hearing more about building jails. I don't know if you heard that in Detroit, building a new jail.
Oh, yeah.
Or the government building more prisons for illegal immigrants so they can incarcerate them. And now jails has become a prison industry, right? It's no longer just one jail, but a prison industry. Building jail is a business. So this is my final remarks here. Constitutional rule in Spain, in Puerto Rico, left the colonial bond relationship intact. He supported Spanish Second Empire, the creation of a second empire, with the Hispanic Caribbean as the new economic engine. Constitutionalism stimulated liberal thinking, however, and that ultimately meant that there will be criticism about the type of institutions that were created in the Second Empire. At the 1812, constitutional moderates and conservatives in Spain promoted liberalism at home, but absolutism in the colonies. It's very, very interesting. A lot of the people in Spain that were very liberal, they advocated women's rights, universal suffrage for males, and stuff like that. When they came to Puerto Rico, they cracked down on everybody. They became overnight dictators. Almost like if crossing the Atlantic transformed their personality. And as a result, slavery remained in place in Puerto Rico until the 1870s. But my argument is that at least the thinking about it was already taking place as early as 1836, 1837. And that, more additional work might reveal that the decline of slavery was probably more rapid in Puerto Rico than what people have imagined until now. In the historiography of slavery in Puerto Rico, people say that we had slavery until 1870, then in 1870 it was abolished, one time, overnight. And I would argue that there was a gradual movement for getting rid of slavery that began 30 or 40 years prior to 1870. Well, that's all I have for you. So thank you very much for listening. If you have any questions or comments, that would be awesome, but I think we don't have a whole lot of time left.
We still have some time. Questions?
You're convinced?
No,
Persuaded?
we're just thinking.
Confused? Well, if you cannot have the time right now, we could talk about it in the class. But any thoughts at all on connecting Spain to Puerto Rico in a transatlantic way as opposed to separating the components?
Question? Okay. Don't let him get off so easily.
Well, in either way, thank you for coming. I enjoy your coming. And those of you who are in the learning community, you have one of these